welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Midnight Shift at Willowbrook Mall. It was another quiet night at Willowbrook Mall. I worked the midnight shift as a security guard, a job I'd taken to pay the bills and avoid the mess of daytime traffic. The mall was long closed to the public, and it was just me and a couple of other staff members on site. Most of the stores had already closed, and the lights had dimmed, casting long shadows across the once bustling corridors. I walked the empty halls, trying to pass the time and keep an eye out for any trouble. The place was nearly always quiet at night. I'd grown used to it. The hum of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of the building settling were the only sounds that filled the otherwise silent space. I had a routine: I'd check the back entrances, make sure the store alarms were set, and then spend the last hour patrolling the main concourse before finally heading to the security office to clock out. But that night, something was different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't the usual eerie quiet that had settled over the mall. It was as if something was waiting. Around 1 a.m., I was taking my usual walk down the long corridor past the old arcade, when I heard something that made my skin prickle: faint footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of the other night staff, but when I looked around, I saw no one. The halls were empty. I paused, straining to hear again, but there was nothing. Just silence. I shook my head. Maybe I was just imagining things. It had been a long shift, and the quiet of the mall had a way of playing tricks on your mind. I continued walking, checking the doors and windows of the stores that were still open. Nothing seemed out of place. As I turned the corner to the food court, the sound came again: unmistakable footsteps. Quick and light, as if someone was running. I froze in my tracks. There were no employees here right now, and the mall was locked up tight. My heart started to race, a chill running down my spine. I quickly turned around, heading back toward the security office. But before I could get far, I caught sight of something in the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement in the arcade section. I didn't want to go toward it, but duty called. I gritted my teeth, trying to shake the uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. The arcade was dark, the flickering lights of old video games casting eerie shadows against the walls. It was one of the last parts of the mall that had been abandoned, left to rot when the newer sections had become more popular. I made my way down the narrow hallway, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up with every step. As I entered the arcade, the lights flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls. I glanced around. There, at the far end, was one of the old arcade cabinets, the one with the flashing red light on top. The screen was on, but the game was frozen. The joystick was moving on its own. My blood ran cold. I couldn't explain it. The game shouldn't have been on. I quickly turned it off, but when I looked down at the floor, I saw something that made my heart stop: a set of small, muddy footprints leading out of the arcade and into the main hall. I was alone. No one else should have been here. I rushed out of the arcade, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and followed the footprints. They led me down a service hallway toward the restrooms. I hated this part of the mall. It was dimly lit, always a little musty, and it had the kind of feeling that made you feel like you were being watched. The footprints stopped right in front of the women's restroom. I hesitated. Should I check? Should I go inside? Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The temperature had dropped significantly. The air was thick, heavy. It felt wrong. I took a few steps forward, the sound of my shoes echoing unnervingly in the silence. The restroom was deserted, as expected. But as I was about to turn around and leave, I noticed something strange. A door at the far end of the restroom, the one that led to the maintenance closet, was slightly ajar. I knew that door was always locked. I could have sworn it had been locked when I last checked. I walked over, my footsteps louder now in the dead silence. As I approached the door, a sharp, metallic screech echoed through the hallway. I froze, heart pounding. Something wasn't right. I reached out slowly, and the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the dim light revealed a small, cluttered room filled with cleaning supplies. But as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the door wouldn't budge. I pulled at the handle, but it was stuck. I was trapped. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the room. It was faint. At first, almost like nails scratching against the floor. I spun around again, trying to locate the source. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. The tapping grew louder. Suddenly, the lights in the room blinked on, and I was momentarily blinded by the brightness. When my vision cleared, I saw something that made my stomach twist, a small figure. Hunched and crouched, sitting in the far corner. It was a child. A little girl. She was staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Her face was pale, gaunt, her hair tangled and unkempt, hanging over her face like a dark curtain. She was wearing a tattered dress that looked like it came from another time. I backed up, my breath coming in short gasps. The door was still locked, and I couldn't take my eyes off the girl. The tapping sound had stopped, replaced by a low, wheezing breath that came from her. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head at an unnatural angle, the movement jerky and wrong. I could see the dark circles under her eyes, and then the thing that made me want to vomit, there was blood on her hands. The room seemed to close in on me. I turned back to the door and pulled with all my strength. But it didn't give. I could hear her shuffling behind me now, her tiny feet dragging across the floor. The sound was slow and deliberate, like she was taking her time. Then I heard her whisper, barely audible, "Leave this place." I screamed. I don't even know how I managed to do it, but somehow I threw my shoulder into the door and it broke open. I rushed out into the hallway, the lights flickering as I ran. The girl's voice followed me, echoing in my mind, "Leave this place." I didn't stop running until I reached the security office. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My heart was pounding, my palms sweaty. I didn't know what I had seen. I didn't know if it was real. But I knew one thing for certain, I never wanted to go back to Willowbrook Mall again. Story: The Last Shift at Ashford Manor. It was a cold autumn night when David first stepped into Ashford Manor, a massive Victorian-era mansion perched on the edge of town. The kind of mansion you read about in ghost stories, with looming towers and windows that seemed to peer down at you like hollow eyes. He had been hired as a security guard, tasked with making sure everything was in order. During the late hours of the night, the previous guards had left the position without saying much, but the rumors around town had already made their way to him, strange noises in the walls, shadows that moved by themselves, and a general feeling that the house was not truly empty. But David was pragmatic. He didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. He had worked as a guard before in places like this, old, run-down buildings with 1,000 creaks and groans. He had always figured it was just the house settling, or the wind. The mind played tricks in the quiet of the night, that's all. He entered the grand lobby, the wooden floors creaking beneath his boots, and walked toward the security room, a small, dark room at the back of the house where he would be stationed during his shift. The house was cold, and the heavy air seemed to press against his chest as if the walls were exhaling some long-held secret. He set his gear down, checking the cameras and locking the doors. All was quiet. David made his rounds at 9 p.m., as instructed, checking every room, every hallway, and every corner of the house. The mansion was so large that even a trained guard like David could feel the weight of the emptiness. He walked down the long corridors, the old wood of the floorboards groaning under his feet. The walls were adorned with faded tapestries and portraits of the Ashford family, rigid, grim faces staring down at him with a cold, calculating gaze. But nothing out of the ordinary happened. It was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the rustling of the wind outside and the soft clink of his flashlight as he moved. Every now and then, he'd catch the faintest smell of something strange, like old perfume or mildew, but he assumed it was just the old house settling. After all, nothing supernatural could be lurking here, just dust, time, and old wood. At around 11:30 p.m., David decided to take a break. He sat in the security room, grabbing a bag of chips from his backpack, flipping through a magazine. It wasn't until the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight that the silence was broken. He heard a sound, faint at first, like a soft thud coming from the second floor. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. A part of him told him it was just the house again, the way old houses settle. But the sound came again, this time louder, as though something heavy had been dropped. David stood up slowly, grabbed his flashlight, and made his way up to the second floor. The grand staircase loomed before him, a massive thing with a dark, polished wood banister that creaked as he climbed. The air up here felt colder, more oppressive. The lights in the hall flickered for a moment, and then all went dark. Great, David muttered to himself, but he wasn't afraid. He wasn't the kind of guy to let a flickering light get to him. He made his way to the nearest light switch, only for it to fail to come on. He pressed on, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed something strange. One of the doors was ajar. It was the master bedroom, the one belonging to the Ashford family patriarch, Edward Ashford, whose portrait hung on the opposite wall, watching over the room. David pushed the door open. Inside, everything appeared to be in order. The large, four-poster bed was made neatly, the curtains drawn, the heavy furniture unmoved. But there, on the floor, was something that made his stomach tighten. A chair had been moved, scraping across the floor in a way that felt out of place, as if someone had been sitting there recently. Probably just an old draft, David muttered, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave him. As he turned to leave the room, something caught his eye, a small glint of light reflecting off a glass object on the nightstand. David stepped closer and picked it up. It was a silver pocket watch, its surface smooth and worn from years of use. He opened it and saw that the time was frozen at exactly midnight. A chill ran down his spine, but David shook it off. It was just an old watch, probably left behind by the previous tenants. He returned to the security room, his heart still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He tried to calm himself, telling himself that he had worked in worse places with more noise, more chaos. But something about Ashford Manor didn't sit well with him. Around 2 a.m., the building seemed to breathe. He had just finished another round of checks when he heard it again, a soft thud from somewhere above him. This time, it was louder, more persistent. The kind of sound you might expect if someone was walking around up there, pacing in the dark. David hesitated but then grabbed his flashlight once more, his nerves fraying. He made his way up the staircase again, his boots tapping softly against the floor. As he passed by the master bedroom, the door was wide open, the room now bathed in the soft, flickering light of the hallway. But this time, there was someone standing inside. A figure, dressed in a dark coat, stood facing away from him, staring out the window. The figure didn't move, not a muscle. David felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "Hey," he called out, his voice tight with unease. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" There was no response. The figure remained still, motionless as a statue. David took a step closer, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but just as he did, the figure turned, its face coming into the light. David's heart nearly stopped. The face was pale, hollow, eyes wide and unblinking. A smile spread across the lips of the figure, a smile too wide to be human. "Welcome home," the figure whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping against the ground. David stumbled backward, his mind racing, panic setting in. He turned to run, but before he could reach the door, the lights flickered violently, plunging him back into darkness. His pulse thundered in his ears. And then, suddenly, there was nothing. The figure was gone. The room was empty. David stood there for a long moment, his breath shallow, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The room was still. No sound. No movement. His flashlight flickered, casting wild shadows across the walls. He didn't know how long he stood there before he finally bolted out of the room, back down the stairs, and into the security room, locking the door behind him. His heart was pounding in his chest. He stared at the security monitors, but there was no sign of anyone. No one had entered the building. The cameras showed nothing but the empty hallways, the dark rooms. But then, as he watched, the camera feed from the master bedroom flickered to life again. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure, just like before, smiling that same unnerving grin. David slammed his hand on the alarm button, the sound of the sirens echoing through the halls of Ashford Manor. He didn't wait around to see if the figure would come for him next. He was done. The next morning, the police arrived to investigate, but they found nothing unusual. No figure, no signs of a break-in. The security footage was wiped clean, and David's account was dismissed as a mistake, perhaps caused by stress or exhaustion. But David knew what he had seen, what he had heard. Ashford Manor had its secrets. And it wasn't ready to let him go just yet. Story: The Forgotten Watcher. It was a late autumn evening when I started working at the old Hawthorne Airspace Museum, a place I had long been curious about. The building was a sprawling collection of wartime planes, spacecrafts, and artifacts from another time. As a teen, I was obsessed with aviation and the stories that came with these relics. But nothing could have prepared me for The strange occurrences that began after I was hired as a night shift cleaner. The museum itself was a mix of awe-inspiring history and eerie quiet, and I felt it the moment I stepped inside. There was something undeniably unsettling about the place. Particularly after hours when the doors were locked and the lights dimmed. The museum had been built in the 1940s, and stories of strange happenings had been passed down through generations. Employees spoke of hearing footsteps when no one was around, cold drafts that came out of nowhere, and objects being moved without explanation. At first, I laughed it off. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But I had no idea how wrong I was. It was around my second week of working the night shift when I first noticed the oddities. The museum was nearly empty at night, except for a few staff members, and on that particular evening, I had been assigned to close up after a catered event. I arrived just before midnight, the usual time to begin my shift. The other workers gave me a brief rundown of what needed to be done before they left. There were a few last-minute checks for inventory, cleaning, and preparing the display areas for the next day. The first eerie incident happened while I was mopping the floor near the wartime plane exhibit. The museum was full of exhibits dedicated to World War II, with rusted aircraft and old military uniforms hanging from the walls. The shadows seemed deeper around the planes, and the hallways stretched on endlessly. As I mopped, I heard what sounded like a man's voice, faint but clear, saying, "Pardon me." It wasn't loud, just a soft whisper behind me, so subtle that I initially thought it might have been someone else in the museum. I turned around quickly, expecting to see another late-night worker or perhaps someone walking through the building who hadn't been noticed. But to my shock, there was no one there. The hallway behind me was completely empty, stretching out into darkness. I took a deep breath and tried to shake off the strange feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I continued mopping, trying to focus on my work. But then I felt it, an unmistakable presence right behind me. It was as if someone was standing just out of sight, watching me. Shaking my head, I moved to another part of the museum. I turned the corner, walking beneath a balcony that overlooked the main exhibit hall, when I felt something hard strike my back. I jumped, instinctively reaching out to catch whatever had hit me. It was a binder clip. One of the large black ones used to hold papers together. I looked up, expecting to see someone, but the museum was dark and silent. No one was in sight. Confused and slightly unnerved, I walked on, hoping to shake off the odd occurrence. As I made my way towards the back offices to clock out, another binder clip hit me square on the shoulder, followed by a third that landed at my feet. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly, but I couldn't explain it. Was someone playing a prank on me? But who could have been hiding in such a large space without me noticing? My heart was racing as I walked briskly to the exit. As I passed by the main security desk, the auto alarm system went off, signaling that I was the last one in the building. The cold draft that followed made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The museum was completely locked down, and the only other sound was the hum of the alarm system. I quickly finished my last few tasks and headed for the door, practically running to get out. The next night, I told the other workers about the strange incidents. They all nodded knowingly. "Oh yeah, you'll get used to it," one of them said with a half-hearted smile. "This place has a reputation for paranormal activity. People say it and #39s haunted. Just part of the job." Their nonchalance made me uneasy, but I figured they were just trying to brush off the unsettling stories. But the incidents didn't stop. Weeks went by, and each night brought something new. One evening, I was cleaning near the spacecraft exhibit, which had always given me the creeps. The models of the old space shuttles hung in the air, and the walls were covered with posters of past space missions. As I worked, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing in the distance, coming from the stairwell that led to the upper floors. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. There was no reason for anyone to be upstairs. I was alone, or so I thought. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up the stairs, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But when I reached the top, the sound stopped. I shined the flashlight around, but no one was there. The eerie silence in the upper hallways was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I checked all the rooms and found nothing. No one else was in the building. The footsteps had stopped, and I was left to wonder if it had been another product of my overactive imagination, or something far more sinister. The final straw came one night when I was working the late shift alone. It was Christmas Eve, and the museum was eerily quiet. I had been finishing up my cleaning duties and was about to leave when I heard something faint, almost a whisper, coming from the old control tower exhibit. I had walked past it many times, but tonight something felt off. My curiosity got the better of me, and I went to investigate. As I stood before the exhibit, I noticed something strange. The old radio equipment, which was usually locked and untouched, had a light flickering from within. The radio crackled to life, and I swear I heard a voice, low, distant, and almost garbled. It wasn't clear enough to make out, but it sounded like a distress call. I backed away, feeling a chill creep down my spine. Something about the air felt thick, like time itself was warping. I turned to leave, but then the lights in the whole building went out. Absolute darkness. Panic surged in my chest. I pulled out my phone, using its light to guide me back to the security office. But as I moved through the hallway, the flashlight flickered and then died. I was plunged into complete darkness. The only sound was the muffled hum of the building's air conditioning and the faint echo of my own breathing. I rushed back to the security office, my fingers fumbling for the keys. I couldn't understand what was happening, but every instinct screamed that I needed to leave. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and get outside into the cold night air. I never went back. Years later, I ran into one of the former night staff at a local coffee shop. He recognized me immediately. "You worked at Hawthorne, right?" he asked, with a knowing smile. "I see. You're not there anymore. That place, it gets to you eventually, doesn't it?" I nodded, not sure what to say. It wasn't until later that I learned about the tragic history of the museum, how many of the workers had died in accidents or under mysterious circumstances. They were the ones, I believe, who still lingered in the shadows, waiting. Hawthorne Airspace Museum may have closed down since then, but it's still a place full of secrets that are better left undisturbed. It wasn't until my second night on shift that I began to question my beliefs. The building had a peculiar atmosphere at night. During the day, it bustled with activity, nurses running from room to room, doctors making rounds, patients receiving treatment. But at night, it was eerily silent. The long hallways felt deserted, and the creak of the old wooden floors echoed through the empty spaces. There were moments when I would walk past rooms that were completely dark, and a chill would crawl up my spine for no reason at all. I told myself it was just the drafts, the old heating system, or maybe my imagination. After all, I had a job to do. Around 1:30 a.m., I found myself in a patient room on the ground floor, taking a break. The hospital had designated a room for staff to rest in during long shifts. It was a small, dimly lit room with a single cot and a chair by the window. The window faced the courtyard, which was lined with overgrown bushes and a few neglected flower beds. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something older, dust, perhaps, or the scent of aged wood from the ancient beams that supported the building. I was sitting on the cot, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. 3 distinct knocks coming from the door. At first, I didn't think much of it. The hospital was full of strange noises, pipes groaning, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, the occasional creak of old furniture. But these knocks were different. They were rhythmic, deliberate, 3 knocks in quick succession. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. A knot formed in my stomach, and I stood up, my heart pounding. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, expecting to see one of my colleagues. Maybe another nurse passing by, or perhaps a patient who needed help. But the hallway was empty. No one was there. I chalked it up to my nerves. It had been a long day, and I was probably just tired. But as I returned to the cot and sat down, the knocking came again. 3 knocks in a row. At that moment, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I was suddenly acutely aware of how alone I was in the building. The thought that I might not be alone, that something was out there, began to creep into my mind. I decided to investigate. I walked down the hallway, looking for any sign of a person, any clue that could explain the knocks. But there was nothing. No one was on the ground floor. I checked the nearby rooms, but all were empty. The feeling of unease only grew. I didn't like the silence, the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have, the way the air felt colder than it had moments before. I returned to the staff room and sat back down, my nerves on edge. I tried to focus on my phone, but the fear gnawed at me. Then, it happened again. 3 knocks, followed by silence. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stood up, my hands trembling. My pulse was racing. I had heard enough of the ghost stories that circulated among the older nurses, stories about the hospital's history, the renovations that had taken place 20 years ago, and the rumors about a matron who had never passed on. It was said that during the renovations, strange things had started happening. Objects moved on their own, windows slammed shut, and lights flickered even though the power was perfectly fine. The hospital was supposedly blessed to drive away the spirits, but not before one of them, the matron, had supposedly lingered. I had always dismissed these stories as nonsense, but now they felt too real. I opened the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. The hallway was still empty. I quickly turned and began heading back upstairs to the ward where I was working, trying to shake the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to me. When I told one of the other nurses, she laughed it off. Probably just the wind, she said, as if it were the most logical explanation. But I could tell she didn't believe it either. The unease in her voice betrayed her. I knew she had heard the stories too. Everyone had. That night, after my shift ended, I couldn't stop thinking about the knocks. I googled 3 knocks of death out of curiosity, even though I was terrified of what I might find. According to various paranormal forums, 3 knocks were often considered a harbinger of death, a sign that something sinister was near. Some people even said that the 3 knocks could signal the death of someone close to you, or perhaps even your own. I had never been one for superstitions, but now, I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to the stories. Why else would the knocks happen 3 times? Why was I alone in the building, and why was it always at exactly the same time? The following night, I worked up the courage to stay on the ground floor for my break again. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid, that it had all been a coincidence. But as I sat in the staff room, I heard it again. 3 knocks. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't move. I didn't want to. I just stared at the door, too afraid to open it. But this time, I didn't need to open the door. From down the hallway, I heard something else. A soft whispering. It was faint, almost like a voice carried on the wind. But the windows were closed, and the air in the hallway was still. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking beneath me. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I walked cautiously toward the door. But when I opened it, the hallway was as empty as it had always been. No one was there. I didn't stay another minute. I ran back upstairs and stayed by the nurse's station for the rest of my shift. I didn't even take another break. The next morning, when I met with the other nurses, I heard one of them mention something that made my blood run cold. "You hear about the nurse that worked here before?" she asked. "She left after a couple of weeks. She said she heard 3 knocks every night, and that's why she quit. She thought it was a warning. Said it meant something bad was going to happen." I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The fear in my eyes was enough. St. Benedict's Hospital has been around for over a century, but I know now that there are things in that old building, things that can't be explained. I don't know if it's the spirit of the matron or something else, but I do know this: I don't work the night shift anymore. And I never will again. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.